Welcome back to Eyes on Israel. As always, Eyes on Israel is powered by Israel 365. Make Israel365news.com the first place you go for accurate news and analysis about everything going on in Israel and related to Israel. And make sure to visit Israel365.com to find my writings as well as other information and products about Israel and writing by many other great authors. Signing up for the Israel 365 daily emails will keep you up to date, informed, and inspired. A few weeks ago on this program, we discussed a recent Biden administration executive order calling for sanctions on Israeli citizens who actively oppose the Biden administration policies in Judea and Samaria, often referred to as the West Bank. Besides the dubious legal status of that executive order, as we discussed, we pointed out at the time that the entire premise of the order, that there has been a surge in anti-Arab violence by Israeli citizens in Judea and Samaria, is false. Now, just last week, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken announced that the U.S. will now be sanctioning a battalion in the Israel Defense Forces, the Netzach Yehuda Battalion. Netzach Yehuda is made up of mostly Orthodox soldiers, many of whom identify with the nationalist right in Israel. The claim is that this battalion is guilty of human rights violations against Arab civilians in Judea and Samaria. Prime Minister Netanyahu correctly called these sanctions of a battalion of the IDF absurd. And Benny Gantz, a leading cabinet minister and former IDF chief of staff, and also Netanyahu's chief rival, also slammed the new sanctions, adding, quote, "The state of Israel has a strong, independent judicial system that evaluates meticulously any claim of a violation or deviation from IDF orders and code of conduct and will continue to do so. I have great appreciation for our American friends, but the decision to impose sanctions on an IDF unit and its soldiers sets a dangerous precedent and conveys the wrong message to our shared enemies during wartime. I intend on acting to have this decision changed," end quote. In other words, like the sanctions based on the executive order we discussed a few weeks ago, the premise of these sanctions is that Israel's own law enforcement is insufficient. Considering that the announcement of these new sanctions comes immediately after the passage of a new aid package for Israel's military, it's safe to say that the Biden administration needed to placate the pro-Hamas wing of the Democratic Party, who would no doubt be uncomfortable with the administration looking too pro-Israel. So why not just demonize Israeli soldiers and call Israel's own stance on human rights into question in the process? One final point. The Palestinian Authority continues to pay lifetime rewards to the families of terrorist murders, as we've discussed on this show. Members of the ruling faction of the Palestinian Authority participated in the atrocities of October 7th, and members of the Palestinian police force have been found guilty of committing acts of terrorism. Has the Palestinian Authority been sanctioned for this? No, they have not. Joining me now is international lawyer Mark Zell, chairman of the Republican Party in Israel and chief counsel for Republicans overseas. Mark Zell, welcome back to Eyes on Israel.
Great to be here, Pesach.
So, Mark, what exactly are we seeing here? Could you explain these sanctions? What would they cover? What is the purported basis for these sanctions? And also, if you could, after that, if you could update us on what's going on with the other sanctions, the ones we talked about a few weeks back.
Okay, Pesach. So I think let's set the record straight here. We're talking about two different sets of sanctions. The ones that you mentioned that we discussed earlier on your show concern sanctions against persons in Israel who oppose Biden administration policies on Israel and Judea and Samaria. That was an executive order that was handed down on February 1st of this year. The sanctions that were discussed or threatened at this point by Secretary Blinken against the Netzach Yehuda unit come under a different legal regime altogether. This regime is referred to as the Leahy laws, named after the former U.S. Senator, Democratic Senator from Vermont, Patrick Leahy, who in 1997 succeeded in getting the U.S. law changed to prohibit the making of security assistance of any sort by the U.S. government to units in foreign armies or for foreign security forces, which were accused of gross violations of human rights. That's the key phrase in the Leahy laws. And what Blinken is doing now, which is very unusual, by the way, because ordinarily when the U.S. government decides to invoke the provisions of the Leahy laws against a unit in a foreign army, they usually don't talk about it in public. It's very rare that they do this. They do it behind the scenes. They consult with the country in question and try to work things out to alleviate the alleged problems. What's significant here is that the U.S. government made a very big to-do about Israel's alleged violation of of the Leahy laws, and focusing particularly on the ultra-Orthodox unit Netzach Yehuda, on the very day that the Biden administration achieved a bipartisan success in the House of Representatives, transferring or approving large amounts of aid, not only to Ukraine and Taiwan, but also particularly to Israel. And you correctly pointed out, Pesach, that this is all political theater orchestrated by the Biden administration in order to placate radical left-wing supporters of the Democratic Party. That's where we are at the moment. Now, whether these are going to actually be issued, these sanctions are going to be issued against the Netzach Yehuda unit is another thing. We'll wait and see. In view of the strong resistance by the prime minister and by his chief rival who sits in a coalition government at the moment as a member of the war cabinet, that remains to be seen.
Yeah, and here we are, where Israel gets praised by military experts, including those from West Point, and generals around the world for protecting civilian life. And we know that Israel does everything it can to not violate human rights, and the amounts of humanitarian aid being allowed into Gaza, despite all the reports, have been overwhelming. And these sanctions just feed the narrative that Israel is complicit in the gross violations of human rights.
This is outrageous. By the way, the law doesn't define what a gross violation of human rights is, and I think you're correct referring to statements by Professor John Spencer from West Point, who's an expert on modern urban warfare, says that the Israeli army's record in keeping civilian casualties down in the Gaza campaign, despite the deliberate attempt by the Hamas terrorists to expose their citizenry to risk of death and injury, and by hiding their forces underneath civilian homes and institutions, hospitals and mosques and what have you, making it essential and necessary for the Israeli army to destroy these super-adjacent structures in order to reach the terrorists hiding underneath. The record of the Israeli army has been unparalleled. I mean, and really unimpeachable, especially when you consider what the U.S. Army itself, the U.S. Armed Forces itself, have been doing in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and in other venues where they actively were engaged in warfare involving a civilian population. So the accusations against Israel are absolutely ridiculous. Prime Minister Netanyahu said, and I fully agree, that the Netzach Yehuda soldiers have been operating in a professional and courageous fashion for years. And the fact that the State Department is now focusing on them is simply a perversion of the purpose of the Leahy laws and a surrender, basically, to the radical forces in the Democratic Party.
All right, we have a couple minutes left. Could you update us on what's going on with the earlier executive order? At the time, you mentioned that there was a lawsuit being prepared, and also that there would be other individuals or institutions that could be sanctioned down the road. What's happened since we last spoke?
Well, one of the things that has happened, Pesach, is that the administration has imposed sanctions on organizations which were raising funds for the legal defense of persons, Jews in Judea and Samaria, who were sanctioned under that February 1st executive order.
What, so they were sanctioning people who were raising funds to help their legal defense?
Correct.
Wow.
That happened this past week, and we warned. I think you and I may have discussed this. We warned that this might happen, and it has happened. As far as the lawsuit is concerned, Pesach, we have two lawsuits that we are ramping up to file shortly after the Passover holiday, and we expect to file them in two different venues in the United States. One towards the middle of the United States, I can't say where exactly, and the other one in the eastern part of the United States. We have a set of very, very compelling stories and narratives by our plaintiffs in both cases, and we'll keep you updated as soon as those cases are formally commenced.
It's so good to have someone explain things, lay them out, what's happening here. We're going to be continuing to watch this story closely as the Biden administration continues to try to support the narrative that Israel is a bad actor and that Israel is complicit or turning a blind eye to gross human rights violations. And thank you for being a warrior on behalf of the truth, on behalf of Israelis who are just trying to, we're just trying to fight for our lives and do the right thing. We'll be right back with more Eyes on Israel after these words from our sponsors.